we noticed that some previously hidden knots are being solved one at a time. In this report, we will decipher the secret civil war that has been raging within the Russian army because all of the concealed truths that have been kept by Russia's depleted military are coming to light. What are the factors that contribute to the regular turnover of command in the Russian armed forces? What is behind Kadyrov's decision to establish a private military? Will Putin remove the Wagner Group's permission to operate in the occupied territories? Let's take a look at the developments taking place within the Russian army that are setting the stage for the civil war that is likely to break out onto the streets of Russia in the not-too-distant future. Before we get started with this important analysis, we would like to solicit your assistance in order to proceed with the work on our Akka Daily News Supple. Simply by clicking the Super Things button, you'll be able to show your support for our team. Let us begin right away. It is common knowledge that members of the Russian army, Chechen rebels, and mercenaries employed by the Wagner Group do not get along with one another at all. But what exactly do we know about the dynamics of the relationships between the officers in charge of the frontline troops after the events that took place in the city of So? All of the facts that Russia had been hiding, including the fact that it had been dragged into a civil war by the triangle of Putin, Kady, and Precision have gradually come to light. On the 11th of January, the head of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prn, made the announcement that he had taken control of SOR. Have you made any connections between the statement and any other events or developments that took place on the same? The Chief of Staff, Sergei Serviceman, was fired as a result of this new development. Following Cyril Vik's appointment as Chief of the General Staff, the Ukrainian intelligence community issued a statement. According to this statement, Peru, Jean suggested Sieravik Ken for the position of Chief of the General Staff because Zerovik Ken was close friends with percussion Sieravik. Ken accepted the suggest. In 2017, CERV Ken was given the role of commanding the Russian forces stationed in Syria, and the soldiers who made up the Wagner Group all served together in Syria. The friendship between Percussion and Serial Wickens goes back a very long way. Because of this, the Wagner Group became the most notable participant in the war. After Servicki was appointed to the position of Chief of General, mainly due to the fact that CIC, who worked for the Chief of the General Staff, was able to provide Precision with any equipment he desired without much difficulty. In addition, Sir Avik and PN had come together to form an alliance and present a united front against Sergei Shu, the Russian Minister of Defense. But Percussion's drunkenness on power was finally brought to an end when he announced the capture of So. After it was revealed that the Wagner Group had captured Sadar without the knowledge of the Russian military, Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, pulled the plug on Percussion. This was due to the fact that it was the responsibility of the Russian military to make the announcement that a territory had been captured by the Russian state. His close friends, including Sirkin, were cast aside as a result of his. Following the occurrence of this significant event, Yevgeny Ferguson started making statements that were critical of the Russian state. Ferguson made a statement the other day in which he accused the Russian defense minister and the chief of the general staff of betraying their country because they didn't give him what he wanted and got rid of the person who was going to make his dreams come true. Both of these individuals were, according to PRN Defense Minister Shu and Chief of General Staff OV, are advising both the left and the right to refrain from providing Wagner with ammunition. Those who are standing in the way of us winning this war are most assuredly collaborating with our adversaries. Provision, on the other hand, lauded the presidency of Ukraine, Zelensky. He praised Zelensky for being trustworthy, reliable, likable, and statements of precaution made by Russian occupants Putin, Kady, and Preen demonstrated once more that they are forcing their soldiers to fight for their own self-interest. This conclusion is supported by the fact that Preen, a businessman, has the objective of acquiring the underground riches in Sadar. The interests of the occupiers are being served at the expense of the safety of the Russian popul. Ramzan Kady is recognized as a pivotal figure in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Kady ROV has no choice but to maintain his allegiance to the current leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, because Putin controls his freedom, his position, and his future. On the other hand, Kady, much like Ferguson, has begun to make statements that are critical of the Russian, because it is abundantly clear that Putin's time as leader of Russia has come to an end. The following are some of the words that Kadyrov has used in recent months to criticize General Alexander Lapin, who is the commander of the Russian Central Region. If it were up to me, I'd demote Lapin to the rank of private, strip him of all his honors, arm him with a weapon and send him to the front line so he can sully his shame with his own. Lapin was removed from his post and replaced by General Andrei Mordecai a few days after Kadyrov's criticism. It is well known that this individual is close to Kadyrov. In the midst of the upheaval and changes that were occurring within the Russian military, Kadyrov issued a fresh statement, because Cutting Off announced that he would establish a private military company like Progression. The possibility of a civil war breaking out within the Russian army was increased as a result of this statement. Patty Robb stated that there is not a shred of doubt in his mind that such professional organizations are required as a result. Once I finish my work in the civil service, I intend to create a private military company in direct competition with Yev Ferguson. I believe that there won't be any problems similar to PGA. Patty Rove credited the advancements made at the front to the work of his own soldiers. As a result of this, he was relentless in his criticism of Russian commanders. However, due to the fact that the Chechen soldiers were fighting under the command of the Russian, Katie Ra was unable to accomplish what he desired. Had erupted unrest within the ranks of the Russian armed forces is only going to get worse as a result of the launch of a new private military company, because Katie Ra can fortify his position and better compete with Putin if he uses the private military company he owns. He is capable of engaging in a power struggle similar to that of PR. In this scenario, the covert conflict within the Russian armed forces will be brought into the open. Putin's exhaustion is the cause of these developments, which are taking place hours before the beginning of the first year of the war. The Ukrainian army's consistent ability to launch successful offensive operations has gradually forced the Russian army into an increasingly difficult defensive. The Russian army has suffered a loss of approximately 150,000 service members in just 1 year. The people of Russia are constantly organizing demonstrations in an effort to end the occupation because of Putin's personal interests. Young people in Russia have no interest in serving in the military, and a large number of Russian soldiers are either surrendering to Ukrainian forces or fleeing the front. All of these events have led to the beginning of preparations for Russia that is without Putin. Howdy, Rob's announcement that he will establish a private military company, and the provision statements that he has made confirm this. Oligarchs and politicians in Russia are vying for positions in the government that will take place after Putin's term ends. The conflict that involves the Russian army and the various factions has been brought up for discussion on multiple occasions. The soldiers are made to feel ashamed of their race while they are touching each other. Soldiers serving with the Wagner group in the Russian army do not pay attention to their commanders. This situation leads to a significant number of difficulties for the army. These issues are getting worse, and the preparations for after Putin are picking up speed. By the day, Russia is losing power at an alarming. The likelihood of a civil war breaking out in Russia is increased as a result of this. On the other hand, the leader of Ukraine, Zelensky, is continuing to make history against the Russian invaders in unity with the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian people. The sole objective of the Ukrainian military, which has been bolstered by aid packages from Western and European countries, is to ensure that the country does not lose any territory to the EVA. On the other hand, the objective of the Russian army is decided upon by the preferences of the individual for the sake of their own individual desires and interests. Putin, Kady, and Prin are directly responsible for the deaths of thousands of young people in Russia. The more Russia gets closer to losing, the more information from the secret notebooks is exposed. What kind of ideas do you? Will Kady Rob's establishment of a private military company affect the way the conflict is ultimately resolved? What are the repercussions of Percussion pulling his troops back from the front lines? How much longer will Putin, who is getting fewer and fewer allies as time goes on, be able to keep this war going? We are interested in hearing your point of view. Keep up with us here for further. The App Daily News YouTube channel owns these videos and all of their associated intellectual property. You can find out our usernames on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook by going to App Daily News. You should not rely on any other publications found on social media. We pursue legal action against every website and channel that utilizes it without our author. An explosion has occurred at what was one of the most significant military headquarters in Russia. The Kremlin is holding an emergency meeting. The resignation of Vladimir Putin is being called for. The Russian bureaucracy is experiencing a number of significant issues at the moment. Putin was visiting the military when he was forced to flee to the Kree. When a soldier responded, the number of people held in out-quarters detention skyrocketed. Putin is not wanted by the armed forces. Following the discovery of the military headquarters where Putin was hiding out, the Ukraine coordinated an operation directed toward that location. The repercussions were extremely detrimental for Russia. In response to the growing number of anti-war demonstrations in Moscow, people began collecting signatures. The most powerful bureaucrats in Russia took action. Putin's decisions, which he made without considering the implications of his actions, began to disturb people from all walks of life in Russia. At a time when Russia was experiencing recent economic difficulties, Putin was hit hard by the consequences of this. It was decided that Vladimir Putin should step down from his position as president of Russia immediately during a clandestine meeting that was attended by the majority of the Kremlin's bureaucrats. In addition to this move by the deputies who felt that Putin's KGB-style methods of problem-solving were out of place in the modern world, all different kinds of popular straight-up began to rise up. The fact that the generals and other members of whose names had been linked to the coup in the past, made their decision in private as one of the most significant headlines, achieving a peaceful relationship with the Ukraine. This failed invasion attempt, which once again exposed Russia's military incompetence, began to warp the generals' perceptions of reality. On the other hand, it was stated that this wasn't just about these generals, but rather that the entire army shared the same. Because of the extensive intelligence gathered by the KGB, Vladimir Putin was aware that the KGB was planning to ask for his resignation. Putin, who had left the Kremlin specifically because he was aware of how significant the repercussions of the army planning a coup against him would be, pretended that he was living to check the headquarters after he had left the Kremlin. When he stopped to inspect one of the military outquarters in the Luhansk region, everything became clear to him. At that moment, Putin was taken completely by surprise by the events that transpired. The soldiers pretended not to notice Putin's arrival and did not respond in any way. Almost immediately after that, a soldier from the army startled everyone in the vicinity of the incident. "You are taking us to Ukraine, armed with antiquated weapon. Is there no worth in what we do?" Putin's bodyguard launched a surprise assault on him. The remaining members of Putin's bodyguards reacted quickly and surrounded the president before aligning themselves against the soldiers in order to protect him from any potential danger. As the pressure mounted, it occurred to me once more. Right after this, the soldier was apprehended and taken to the prison that is located beneath the headquarters to be disciple. This served as a demonstration of how severely Putin could act. Putin, who was caught off guard by this response, decided that the best way to defuse the situation was to have dinner with the troops. But his hopes were dashed when he was met with a response that he had not anticipated before the meal. Putin had the table set up in the dining room reserved for the soldier. He stood up in front of the troops and assured them that the Russian army would emerge victorious from the conflict. After that, not a single one of the soldiers responded to what he said. Putin took a seat and then summoned his assistant to try some of his food. Then the heir took a spoonful of the food and fell to the ground, putting his bodyguards immediately surrounding Putin and taking him out of the area, putting in order to guard, to throw the commander of the outquarters into prison to be tried by a military court. Then the heir took a spoonful of the food and fell. Then the heir took a spoonful of the food and fell. Then the heir took a spoonful of the food and fell. Then the heir took it as anticipated that this commander will be tried and sentenced to death. But the real problems began after he passed. The information that Putin was not in the Kremlin, but rather in a military headquarters in Luhansk, was relayed to Ukraine by Israel and the United Kingdom, both of which had been giving Ukraine significant support for an extended period of time. The veterans of the Ukrainian army were able to finish their preparations in a short amount of time and immediately went into. The Ukrainian government began to make preparations by mobilizing its forces because nobody knew how long Putin's journey would take. Each passing second was treated as though it were of vital significance. The first thing that happened was the directors went out to scope out their path. The results of the sonar scans indicated that there are no potential roadblocks in the way. This conclusion was reached as a direct consequence of the scans. As soon as Ukrainian special forces were informed about the situation at the military outquarters, they immediately began to mobilize infantry units from Ukraine, set up a sea force that was controlled remotely all around the area in preparation for surprise attacks that would cause the Russians to abandon their possession. The explosion of one of those C4s allowed the Russian army to immediately come out and engage the Ukrainian army, which had been the source of the initial damage to the Russian. When it became clear that there was no opposition, groups emerged from the defensive position and immediately went on the offensive by throwing grenades. While this was going on, their quarters continued to be bombed and Davis was notified about it. But in the meantime, it was discovered that the adjusters had completely shut down. At this point, the Ukrainian army came up with a brilliant plan, and they began by activating the jammers. After that, they began firing their HAMAs, which caused a very large hole to be made in the north gate, which stopped every landless barrage, destroyed the outbuildings that belonged to the Russian ministry. During the conflict, many Russian soldiers were killed, but the Ukrainian army was able to mobilize the completely freed territory inside the country. After searching each floor of one by one, the Ukrainian army located the body of Putin's assistant in the dining room. After conducting a thorough search after that, they examined the text messages that were stored on the phone that they had removed from his pocket. They were taken aback and their mood was altered. After this point, roughly an hour ago, the active use of jammers completely prevented any news from reaching the Kremlin. This was in conjunction with the destruction of the outquarters. Due to the circumstances, a significant number of soldiers were killed without Putin's. Both the Ukrainian army made the most of the situation and was able to capture the commander of the headquarters. We owe a debt of gratitude to the commander, who it turned out had been wrongfully incarcerated. Everyone on the planet was aware of the attempt on Putin's life. The videotaped confessions of the general were delivered to Vladimir Putin in a manner that no one could have anticipated. The jammers were disabled, and the video was shared with Putin's chief bodyguard. after the 8-cell phone was taken by Ukrainian soldiers. This smell incites a fit of rage in it. Immediately following this, Vladimir Putin made the decision to convene an extraordinary meeting. The people he invited to this meeting have the potential to shoot the whole world. He spoke on the phone with Valery Jur, who is the chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation. He also spoke with Sergei Su, who is the defense minister, and Valentino Matvienko, who is the fourth president of the Federation Council. To put it another way, everyone in the Russian Federation who holds a high position of authority besides Vladimir Putin was asked to attend this meeting. The meeting took place in the Kremlin despite the fact that no members of the opposition parliament were allowed to attend. The decisions that were made at the meeting, which was attended by a large number of high-level bureaucrats, caused reverberations all over the world. A little over 9 hours were spent in total on the meeting. Immediately following the conclusion of the meeting, Vladimir Putin announced a series of decisions that will completely anti-democratize Russia. At the beginning of these decisions, the authority to make use of the initiative was completely vested in the army. Many generals who were suspected of being involved in a coup were relieved of their command in order to carry out extensive reforms within the armed forces. The mechanism that the Federation Council used to make decisions underwent a comprehensive overhaul, and the Council's authority to make decisions was severely constrained. In particular, he announced that he had established an election supervision board and appointed himself as the board's chairman in order to ensure that there was a single authority on elections. This was done in order to guarantee that there was a single authority on elections. As a result of this decision, he made the announcement that a new board will be established under the name of the Coup Prevention Commission in order to prevent an attempt at a coup from occurring in the nation of which he is the head of. Putin claimed that he was once again the primary individual responsible for making decisions in this commission. Putin has announced that the 340,000-strong National Guard army, which was established against those who want to destroy the administration, will be further strengthened, and that he has given almost unlimited authority against anyone who opposes the administration. War analysts believe that these decisions are the most significant indicators, yet that Putin's rule will soon come to an end. Putin has been in power for 30 years, and in all that time he has never been so insecure as to make decisions like these. But now that it is abundantly clear that Putin is losing power, he felt it necessary to make these decisions. How far did Vladimir Putin anticipate getting with this shaky go? Once again, it is becoming abundantly clear how Vladimir Putin, who does not give the people any freedom or even the tiniest sliver of it, intends to maintain his hold on power. There is a new form of government that is anti-democratic and does not have any constraints on what it can do. He is able to carry on with his activities without giving a second thought to the people. However, the 21st century is not equipped to deal with dictatorships of this magnitude. As a result, regardless of how severe Putin's decisions are, it is abundantly clear that this is what the outcome will be. The conflict had been going on for 1 year. It has now entered Russian territory. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has started to express his disapproval of the operations that have been organized by. Nobody anticipated that the war that has already lasted a year between Russia and Ukraine would continue for another year. There is widespread skepticism among military analysts that the conflict will be resolved within the next few months, or that the Russian army will occupy all of Ukraine within the next few weeks. But the forces of the Ukrainian government have put an end to all of these rumors. The Russian military had a difficult time overcoming the resistance put up by the Ukrainian army in the early months of the conflict, and this earned the Ukrainian military praise from countries all over the world. The fact that the Ukrainian army put up such a fight against the invading Russian forces in the early months of the conflict demonstrated that the Ukrainian service members would not capitulate. On the other hand, we can now say that Ukraine is gaining ground, and as a result of this circumstance, Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, has started to feel quite uneasy. Putin, the leader of Russia, has recently had trouble sharing Russia's security concerns with his colleagues. In order for Putin to regain control of his country and all of its strengths, he has been forced to make some difficult decisions. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is no longer confined to the battlefields at their respective front. The number of airstrikes that Russian forces are launching against Ukrainian cities has increased. As soon as Vladimir Putin realized that he was losing Tovo, he began to attack Ukraine using a variety of different strategies. Instead of engaging in combat on the front lines, both nations began attacking the military headquarters and ammunition storage (FFA) facilities of. On the other hand, this was not sufficient for Putin, so he decided to launch an assault on the energy infrastructures in Ukraine. Putin did not stop these attacks despite widespread international condemnation of them as crimes against humanity and war crimes committed by the Russian army. The energy infrastructure in a number of Ukrainian cities, including Kiev, has recently come under attack from the Russian. In an effort to put an end to these assaults carried out by the Russian military, officials from the Ukrainian government started communicating with Putin. HIMARS missiles were provided by the United States to the Ukrainian army so that it could carry out an entire operation against some energy infrastructure in the city of Belgorod, which is located in the Russian. Recently, it has also targeted gas pipelines and Navy ships inside of Russia's borders, which has resulted in damage being caused to Russia. The Ukrainian army is not the same as it was when the war first started. It has undergone significant transformation. The Ukrainian military has been able to successfully complete a number of operations inside the country as a direct result of the military assistance that has been provided to it by the countries that are a part of the NATO alliance. Russia's borders. Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, must be feeling quite terrified about the current situation. The people of Russia have also begun to feel a great deal of unease regarding the air operations that have been organized by the Ukrainian army. The majority of people who live in Russia are of the opinion that Vladimir Putin is no longer able to ensure the safety of Russia and the people who live there. Putin has begun to take some measures to prevent these operations, just as the Ukrainian army has increased the number of times it has carried them. These attacks carried out by the Ukrainian army have already begun causing significant damage to the Russian capital. In order to defend itself against these assaults, the Kremlin started putting in place some hard and fast security measures. The Russian government, under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, has installed anti-aircraft defense systems on the rooftops of a number of buildings in the capital city of Moscow, as well as on the rooftops of several defense and administrative buildings. Putin, the leader of Russia, is under the impression that Ukrainian forces will launch their next attack with Leon missiles against Moscow. In preparation for this attack, Putin has placed Pantsir missile systems on the roofs of certain buildings located along the Moscow River. The pictures of these missile defense systems were then distributed across various social media platforms. The general population of Russia started to feel more uneasy in the district of Moscow. A new air defense system was recently installed atop an inclination building. It is believed that the Russian military is preparing for a new offensive that is scheduled to take place in March by deploying these RD-fast systems approximately 1.5 miles southeast of the Kremlin. Because the Ukrainian army has a large number of unmanned combat vehicles, Putin has a great deal of concern about airstrikes that could be launched by the Ukrainian. It has been reported by various Russian media outlets that a significant number of long-range defense systems, such as S-400 Pennsylvania 1, have been installed in Moscow. Some pro-Kremlin bloggers have stated that the likelihood of the next attack by the Ukrainian army being on Moscow is growing, and the Russian government has become concerned about attacks on cities as a result of these statements. A significant number of journalists who advocate for war in Ukraine are under the impression that the Ukrainian army will soon launch an assault on Moscow. It would appear that these claims have some basis in reality, given the preparations made by the Kremlin. Putin, the leader of Russia, is extremely concerned that the Ukrainian army will launch an assault. The preparations that Russian forces are making are not limited to the territory of Russia. At the same time, it has begun to deploy air defense systems in some of the regions it has occupied on Ukrainian territory and which are located within Ukrainian territory. Luhansk, you shouldn't ask Zizia and Harrison which Putin and next are the most important for Putin, because they won't know the Russian army was ultimately defeated as a result of Ukraine's successful retaking of these regions. In recent weeks, Vladimir Putin has begun installing pawn air defense systems in various areas of Donetsk, which may indicate that he does not want this to occur. The Russian forces are being placed in a very precarious position as a result of the air operations conducted by the Ukrainian army on the secondary front. Putin, who is concerned about the loss of the entire Donetsk Scapula, has recently begun to take preventative measure. Recently, the Ukrainian armed forces have been engaging in a significant number of airstrikes in the region known as the Bakhmut. The war is currently becoming more intense. Soldiers from Ukraine who are attempting to thwart Russian incursions into the city of Beechwood. By strategically placing air defense systems in this region, we can effectively thwart both the ground and aerial assaults launched by the Russian. Numerous aerial operations have been carried out by the Ukraine ever since it began employing the HIMARS missiles that had been supplied by the United States. The most significant of these operations resulted in the loss of the lives of 400 Russian soldiers within the past few weeks. The Russian military forces that were stationed in this region were dealt a blow by the Ukrainian army after they organized an air operation in the city of Mochika and Delta. According to Russian Defense Minister Igor Konov statements, there were Russian soldiers located in a building in the Donetsk region, and that building was attacked by the Ukrainian army, resulting in the deaths of 83 Russian soldiers. According to reports from other Ukrainian officials, the attack resulted in the deaths of more than 400 Russian soldiers. We are aware that the Russian government is very adamant about maintaining the confidentiality of battlefield data and preventing its dissemination. Because of this, it is not accurate to say that the people of Russia believe the statements that are made by officials from the Russian government because he is in complete control of the Russian media. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has an extremely easy time manipulating the Russian. During the war, this was one of the most important strategies that Putin employed. Putin was attempting to keep Russian citizens in the dark about the true losses suffered by the Russian army in Ukraine in order to achieve his goal. During the course of the war, Russia has been subjected to a great deal of economic suffering, and the population of Russia finds this to be a source of great union. It's possible that if the real information about those 4 Russians had been made public, the Russian people would have revolted, and that would have been the end of Putin. For this reason, Putin places a high premium on maintaining the confidentiality of information pertaining to the conflict. The sanctions and embargoes that the United States and other Western countries have placed on Russia have caused significant harm to the countries. The recent spike in Russia's inflation rates has contributed to an increase in the level of public ire directed toward Putin among Russian citizens. In spite of the fact that Vladimir Putin has given the impression that the Russian people are on board with this war, this is not the case. The vast majority of Russian citizens are opposed to Putin's invasion of Ukraine and do not support his actions. In addition, Putin's decision to partially mobilize the Russian military, which included forcibly recruiting a large number of Russian citizens into the Russian army and sending them to Ukraine, was the final straw that broke the patience of Russian citizens. As a result, Russians have reached their limit of tolerance. Protests against the war and demonstrations against Putin were held in Russia at the same time that the Russian army was moving into territory that belonged to Ukraine. Aside from that, Putin's authoritarian regime was successful in putting an end to these demonstrations. Next news. In many ways, the Ukrainian army achieved successful results piecemeal in its attacks in Kyiv and Kherson region. These piecemeal successes helped the Ukrainian forces achieve an important victory in these areas. But the Ukrainian army does not want to win a piecemeal victory when it comes to crime. Ukrainian forces want to strike the Russian troops in Crimea like lightning. The Ukrainian army needs more than the weapons it uses in the current military. In order to realize this plan, the Kiev government began to work to obtain these weapons from their Western allies. As you know, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky did not leave his country even during the times when the Russian troops were overwhelmingly superior. The Ukrainian leader made only 2 trips abroad aiming to find help for the liberation of Ukraine. The Ukrainian leader made the first steps of his trips abroad to the United States, which is the biggest supporter of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian leader gave first-hand information to Joe Biden about the course of the war and stated the weapons needed by the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian leader got what he wanted at online conferences and on a trip to Ukraine's Western allies have always prepared the military aid packages. Ukraine needed Ukrainian leaders. Zelensky made the second of his trips abroad to England. Rishi Sunak promised to send more military equipment and weapons to Ukraine. After President Zelensky's visit to the UK, Kiev and London likely reached an agreement to supply Ukraine with the AGM-84 Harpoon and Storm Shadows, air-to-surface long-range anti-ship cruise missile. Considering that the Ukrainian forces will launch a large-scale attack on Crimea, the AGM-84 Harpoon and Storm Shadows anti-ship missiles to be procured from the UK will play an important role in recapturing Crimea. The Harpoon missiles cost around £1.2 million each and have a minimum range of 240 kilo. Storm Shadow missiles cost around £2.2 million and are capable of hitting targets 560 kilometers away. Harpoon anti-ship missiles can be adapted to be fired from trucks, although less accurately when attacking ground targets. Ground firing. Storm Shadow missiles will also be possible, but they're more likely to be fitted to Ukrainian aircraft. If these missile isles are delivered to Ukraine, Minsk will be attacked on the territory of Gomel and Grodno, not to mention the smaller areas of the centers. Oriol, Kursk, Belgorod, on Don and others are located on the territory of Russia, one of the major cities located in the zone of destruction of these missiles, which poses a rather serious danger. In addition to these regions, Ukrainian forces will be able to easily carry out attacks on Russian, both in the whole of Crimea and in important points of the Black Sea. It is clear that the Western allies have changed their minds that Crimea is an occupied territory and a legitimate target. Western allies softened their stance on sending long-range assault weapons. The idea that weapons that would give Ukraine the ability to attack Crimea would escalate. The war disappeared. Russia has many military bases in Crimea. As you know, Ukrainian forces are attacking many Russian targets in Crimea with these attacks inflicted serious damage on Russian military bases. But Ukrainian forces were unable to carry out simple and frequent attacks on Russian military bases. In Crimea, Storm Shadows, anti-ship missile isles with a range of 560 kilometers, will allow an easy attack on Russian military bases in Crimea. from areas under Ukrainian domination after being targeted by Ukrainians with US rocket. Putin's generals began to pull their command centers and arsenals further from the front line. Russia will not remain unresponsive about the supply of very long-range missiles to the Ukrainian forces. Vladimir Putin sees Crimea as a red line. The Crimean Peninsula, which Putin sees as the pearl of the Black Sea, has a very turbulent past. Crimea is of great importance for the Russians during the Soviet Union period, and now the peninsula, which helped the Soviet Union resist the Nazis in the Second World, also played an important role in Russia's full-scale invasion plan. With the advantage of owning the Crimean Peninsula, Russian troops attacked the coastal regions of Ukraine and prevented Ukraine from reaching the Black Sea. There was also a large number of military reinforcements of the Russian troops in the Crimea to the Khan and Zaporizhzhia region. These reinforcements caused the war in the Khan and Syria region to be longer in blood. Ukrainian forces want to end the Black Sea oppression, liberate the Khan and Syria regions more easily, and liberate the Crimean lands that were taken from them by force and fraud. Crimea is of great importance to Russian forces, providing great flexibility on the battlefield. In addition, Crimea is of great importance for the Kremlin government. As you know, Vladimir Putin set out to gain new lands in Ukraine. However, the loss of Crimea on this road would be a trickle for the Kremlin government and Russian leader of Vladimir Putin. In November, Ukrainian forces carried out massive counterattacks on Khan. In response to these counterattacks, Russian lawmakers concluded that the Ukrainian forces did not have the necessary strength to attack Crimea. A Russian MP stated that if Ukrainian forces attack Crimea, the Russian army will crush the Ukrainian army. Considered the disadvantages of a Russian Crimea, allowing Putin to hold Crimea will reward his initiative, however, backing Ukraine in reclaiming territory, sends a clear message that forced land acquisitions will be contested, which could deter other powers from similar adventures. And as a serial aggressor, Putin will take advantage of any time and place given to him to rebuild and rearm the Russian army, which will eventually be used to undo Ukraine's last advance and then inflict further damage. The successful capture of Crimea in 2014 gave him confidence that he could take the rest of Ukraine, allowing Putin to hold Crimea would provide him with a strategic platform for Russia to continue its hybrid gray zone harassment and possibly future reoccupation. By leaving this possibility open, the United States would risk wasting the resources, efforts, and support it has devoted to Ukraine to fend off Russia's latest round of aggression. Besides posing military hazards, Crimea, Black Sea ports are critical to maritime trade and therefore critical to Ukraine's economic revival. If Russia holds Crimea and has unimpeded access to these ports, it will almost certainly use them to thwart Ukraine's post-war economic recovery beyond its implications for the West's strategic goals. Ukraine's own security vision is important in itself. Ukrainians are winning. Morale is high, and polls show that an overwhelming percentage of their population wants to put Crimea back under Ukrainian. It seems that the Ukrainian armed forces will continue to progress in line with these goals. But as the war continues and Ukrainian troops gain more and more victories on the battlefield, Crimea is Ukraine, and it will become clearer that its armed forces will take it back. With the influence of Western aid and the perseverance of Ukrainian forces, we clearly saw that Ukrainian forces have the potential to launch an attack on Crimea in as little as 4. As Ukrainian forces increase their offensive power and get closer to what they need to liberate Crimea, the Kremlin government is more willing to negotiate with Ukraine during the first negotiation period. The Russian authorities, who do not care about their nose, are willing to make an agreement with Ukrainian forces. However, Ukrainian forces think that the Ruro of Crimea, which was annexed in 2014 under Ukrainian control, will have a great impact within the scope of the Nagodi. By liberating the Crimea, the Ukrainian forces will literally achieve their goal.